I'm Austin Lugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and Body Snatchers.
That was pretty good. Before we get into this week's film, I don't know why I do this. I like close it out right before, and I know like we just talked about it, but I want to make sure I
Yeah,
get the
we
name
were
right.
just 2 seconds
I know it was 2 seconds. I have a
ago.
lot of thoughts going on in my head. We are going to be watching Last Year at Marion Bend by who, Andrew?
Well, Alain René, French director.
The French guy. I'm excited. We've been watching a lot of English films lately, or at least this year. Like,
I wonder if it has something to do with us speaking English.
I mean, I think that could play a part in it. But this year, more than any other year, we've watched more American films and films in English than I think any other year in our 4-year history is. We're about to episode 200. I think this is going to be our
Yeah,
200th episode. Isn't
last
that
year, Marion
crazy?
bad moment. Yep.
But I'm excited. Big
Mhm.
fan of Hiroshima Mon Amour. I'm pretty sure I've seen Night and Fog, but I don't think I've seen any of his other stuff. Have you seen anything other than those?
No, I've just seen Night and Fog. I haven't seen
Oh,
Hiroshima
you
Mon
haven't
Amour, but
seen
I've
any of
seen
them.
Night and Fog, obviously, and
Okay.
I think what like Mikhail Haneke said that it was like the one good like the only worthy like a Holocaust movie or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's probably true.
but I'm assuming this one is different. I'm assuming his features are probably a little different than that, more or
Yeah.
less.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm very excited. But this week we did a trilogy, our second trilogy after the Before trilogy. But what's different about this trilogy from that trilogy is, of course, Before trilogy all have the same director, same actors. It is a traditional trilogy where this is more three films inspired by each other. I think there's an argument to be made, at the very least, that the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers and the 1970s Invasion to the Body Snatchers, you could argue that it is perhaps a light sequel in the sense that, of course, the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers takes place in a small town in California. Aliens come,
Yeah,
they invade, blah blah
San
blah.
San Mira, I think is what it was called.
Yes, Santa Mira. Santa
That's it.
Mira,
Yeah.
which I don't think is a real town. I'm pretty sure that it's a fictional town in California.
Really?
I
Hmm.
don't, I don't think so. But you know what? All the people in Santa Mira, this
Oh, it is
possibly a real
fictional.
town.
Yeah, I see.
Okay,
I
that's
see
what I
right here. It's
thought.
fictional. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like like a small
Like
Southern
a
California
small,
town.
like San
Yeah,
Diego, California
yeah.
coastal town, that sort of thing. Just a fictional town in California. And of course, this is all about small town America. And then in the next one, of course, it takes place in San Francisco. And of course, you have the cameo from the actor from the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers doing his famous line from the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which could suggest,
Kevin McCarthy.
yeah, that perhaps this is a sequel to the
Oh yeah, yeah.
original.
It is kind of funny, yeah. Or maybe not a sequel, a continuation. And it does seem he acts and looks as if like he acts and looks as if like nothing has changed since like if you watch him
Mhm.
back to back, it's funny. It's as if he like he's been wearing like the same clothes and been doing the same things since 1956, and now it's 19 what like 78 is when the movie came
Yeah,
out, the
like
70s movie
22
came out.
years
So
later.
yeah, I know what you mean. But no, that's just a nice cameo. And of course, uh 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 there's the second cameo. Did you catch the second cameo in the 70s movie
What was the
also?
second cameo?
When they go in the taxi to go to the airport like later on in the movie,
Yeah.
that's Don Siegel. That's the taxi driver.
Holy shit. I didn't
Yeah, it's
realize
Don
that.
Siegel. I recognized him because he plays a small role in Clint Eastwood's very first directed film, Play Misty for Me, where he plays a
Hmm.
bartender and he appears like multiple times. It's like a very small role, but I recognized him. I think these movies are more or less made around the same time, so it looks the same. So I was like, oh yeah, it's Don Siegel. Yeah. So
Wow.
yeah.
That's wonderful. I
I
mean, yeah.
yeah. Continue. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say that I mean, I'd seen the original and then I rewatched it. So I watched them in chronological order. I rewatched the original,
Yeah,
then I
I
watched the
did too.
second one and
Yeah.
then the third one. And it is amazing how similar yet different the first two are. I mean, in some senses, it hits all of the exact same beats. I mean, you have the sort of
I think
cast of
I,
four.
I think all three do pretty much. I think they all kind of hit the same ish beats. I think each movie kind of subsequently changes the formula, but
Yeah.
I think they all kind of add up in the same kind of, beats and things going on. It's all generally the same
I mean, it's the
like
same
premise, the
premise.
same idea. Yeah, it's the same premise all the way through. It's just again, uh you can kind of like look at it how, again, you know, how writers and directors, depending on what time period it is and what their background is and things like that, are able to kind of like tweak it and make a completely different movie.
Yeah.
And of course, like change of location is important as
Mhm.
well, obviously.
And what I love about this trilogy in particular, because before we started the podcast, we were watching trilogies and we watched a shit ton of them.
Sure.
We watched like 10 or 15 trilogies. And of course, most trilogies typically either same director or same actors. And this is, of course, is not a traditional trilogy, quote unquote, but it could be watched all three of these films in a row. But what's great about this is they
Yeah.
are very different time periods, the late 1950s, late 1970s, and mid 1990s. And
Yep.
so each of these sort of use the concept of the body snatchers to represent a fear that
Mhm.
is happening to them at that time, right? You could argue the original one has to do with this idea of communism and the domino effect. The second one is much more about the
Cold War.
death of the marriage. What'd
Yeah.
you say? Oh, yeah,
Yeah, Cold War,
the
you know
Cold
what you're saying. Yeah.
War.
And yeah, 70s, yeah.
And then, of course, the 90s one is sort of like this ultra militarization of the United
Hmm.
States. And
And the
uh,
degradation of the family, just kind
yeah,
of like the realization that maybe the nuclear family isn't necessarily the right framework at the right
mhm,
time necessarily. It's not like this pure thing.
mhm. Even though all three of these films are in essence the same film. I mean, they're all coming from the same
Yeah.
premise and they follow a lot of the same beats. A lot of the same things happen in this piece. It's just
Hmm.
who is involved, I suppose, changes. And of course, who are protagonists changes through all four pieces. Where in the original, it's a doctor who
Yeah.
has left town for a while. And I think that's kind of interesting that when he comes back, because the original one
Yeah.
takes place. Actually, you know what? I think both of the first two, they both take place in a very short amount of time. Well, no. Does the second one take place in a short amount of time, or is that one kind of over a longer period?
I like to think it's over a longer. Well, I
Yeah.
like to think it's maybe over the same kind of like amount of time as the first movie. I don't think
Okay.
it's over. I think like I know what you mean. Um, it's kind of tough because with the black and white photography, it's kind of hard to tell, when it's like day or night and things like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know what I mean? Like sometimes it's kind of hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like, yeah, the second movie, it kind of feels like it. Sometimes it feels like time gets kind of lost, Like there's those
Mm-hmm.
moments with like Donald Sutherland, which by the way, rest in peace, unbelievable actor, by the way. He's
One of the
great in this
greats.
movie, and I've seen him in other movies too where he's amazing. Rest in peace, he's awesome. He was a badass. He's got a great look. He's got a great voice. Him being the protagonist of this movie is a treat. He's fantastic, and honestly, the cast in the '70s movies in general is fantastic. Like
Yeah.
some of the biggest heavyweights. Brooke Adams, I love her. She's really great. But anyway, um, like that part where he's like in the city and he's like trying to like get someone like on the phone, right? And he's in like the phone booth and the camera's like whipping around him and
That
stuff
is
like that.
awesome
Stuff
scene.
stuff like that is just kind of like, whoa, it's like a very more whiplashy movie than the original, which is very kind of like for the most part pretty kind of like tied down. But
Yeah.
in a in a really effective way, of course. And occasionally like Siegel, he adds like some flair to it with
Mm-hmm.
like in terms of like close-ups and things like that that really kind of add to it. The thing about the original movie, another movie I've seen that was kind of made around the same time that's very similar that is kind of like in this kind of same universe is like The Blob. Have you ever seen The
Yeah, I
Blob?
have seen, I sure have.
The Blob is fun, but it's worse than than the
Yeah.
56 Body Snatchers movie, just because like I don't know. I think Siegel does add a lot to the direction, and it's a little sillier and less frightening.
Yes.
because the blob is just like it's like strawberry jam looking kind of thing. But it's kind of interesting because you have like these movies. You have the Body Snatchers 50s movie, the 70s movie, and then the 90s movie. I one movie that I really like that also is kind of like in the same kind of like I don't know, you could say like not universe, but kind of like same kind of like I don't know
Same aura.
yeah, same yeah, kind of
Hmm.
yeah, is the 1980s Blob remake, which is very
Oh,
good
I have not
and
seen
it
the
very much
remake.
reminds me the remake is really good. It's directed by Chuck Russell and I think
Really?
it's written by Frank Darabont. Um and it's a great movie. I think I've seen it multiple times, and it has great effects similar to, the 70s movie and the 90s movie. I feel like The Blob kind of like is like kind of like a good connecting film between like the 70s Snatchers movie and the 90s Snatchers movie.
Mm.
So I recommend it. And it kind of has like similar stuff going on where it's like kind of in the 90s movie too, where it's like kind of like you have like these teenagers and, they're kind of like uh disaffected and things like that. And there's like commentary too on religion. Like there's like more stuff. Like there's more kind of serious topics going on than the original The
The
Blob.
original.
While I think the original Body Snatchers movie does have serious stuff going on though, which I think is why it's better. Anyway, that's just my kind of diversion into The Blob.
I do love the original Plum. I remember watching that movie. It's probably been almost 4 or 5 years now, but I had a hell of a good time with it. But it is a film that is very much made as a B movie, and it's produced for that world, right? It's kind of selling that idea where, of course, Don Siegel, he's sort of a much more serious director. And not that
Yeah,
Body
he is.
Snatchers doesn't have its sort of fantastical elements, but they utilize it in a way that it feels grounded. And especially just with Don Siegel's direction in this, it does feel like a much more grounded piece than the two later films, which the 1970s Invasion of the Body Snatchers is probably just the most chaotic of the three, I think. I mean, it's just fucking all over the place. We're
I don't know. The
constantly
third
whipping
movie gets
around.
pretty the third I don't know. I don't know. I will say, just to kind of talk about them all three holistically,
Hmm.
they're all really fun movies. They're really great. Like I gotta say, I think I did a good job picking them out
It's a
because
great
I think
choice.
they're all really entertaining. They all have something kind of like new and interesting to say based off kind of like the same kind of like material. They're all kind of based on this novel too by Jack Finney. And yeah, I just like I had a really good time watching all three. I think they all kind of have like a different thing. I don't know. The third gets pretty, especially by the end, it gets pretty like a guy shoots himself in the head in the third movie,
Did
Host.
not see that coming.
Like the 70s movie is like more kind of like it's almost kind of like a heady it's like a heady kind of science fiction 70s movie, right? Like it's
Hmm.
it's no one's like getting like fucking like no one's shooting themselves in the head. I don't think it gets that dark, but it gets kind of like sort of like it gets like in your head, right? Like where it kind of has that element of that kind of like Manchurian candidate kind of like
Hmm.
paranoid thing going on. So I see what you mean, at least from that perspective.
Yeah, it's cool too that each of these three films, they're playing off of a traditional genre that is outside of the sci-fi. Like, of course, they're all in the world of sci-fi, but they're
Hmm.
also playing off of different genres that they're used to. Like, if the 1950s version has a lot of those elements of noir, or the
Yeah.
1970s versions has that sort of exorcist, almost psychological thriller. Uh,
Planet of the Apes kind of thing. Like Planet of
mhm.
the Apes, like or like a Star Trek, to underneath boys
Oh
literally.
yeah.
And I can't
And
help but think of Star Trek.
always. And the 90s version, I mean, you look at these three films and just with like the most basic understanding or,
Mhm.
knowledge of film history, you're like, I know exactly when this film was made. I mean, the one in the 50s looks everything you would think a 50s film would look like. Same with the one in the
Yeah.
70s and the one with the 90s too. It just has those
Yeah.
elements to it. They're so much of their time. And I think that's one of the great things
Absolutely.
about Body Snatchers. And the reason that you can watch these films back to back, and even though they sort of have the same plots and ideas and premise, and at some points do the exact same thing as the films before them, you can still watch all three and find it enjoyable because they are movies that are so much of their time and of their moment, and they're trying to say
Mhm.
something specific about it. And you could go on to make another 10 of these over the next 50 years, and I think each one would be equally fascinating because they're
Mhm.
constantly having something new to say because they're exploring uh, this fundamental idea of what it means to be human, and are we
Yeah,
human, and if we lose sort of this part of ourselves, is it better? I mean, hell, that's what Avengers Endgame is basically. His Thanos' whole idea is that he's going right,
sure.
that he's
Yeah, I
gonna
guess so.
destroy half the universe because of, I don't know, fucking climate change or whatever. But the idea is the same here, that they'll take over your minds and you'll still exist, right? You still
Mhm.
have that consciousness, but it will be
Yeah, they're not gonna get
almost,
my soul.
yeah, which is that
You're
great
not gonna
Forrest
get my
Whitaker
soul.
line.
Right. Unbelievable. That's so good. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but like yeah, it's like and it's like about like conformity, right? Or anti-conformity, right? Like in the 50s it's like oh, communism is going to make us like conform. And then the 70s movie it's just kind of like the 70s movie is like I think like extra complicated because it's like to me it's kind of like a end of the 60s, beginning of the 80s movie, right? Where you have like the 60s, you have these people who probably grew up in the 60s in the air in the movie, in the 70s movie, who have, fought against conformity and all this stuff. And now they have like kind of like businesses and kind of regular jobs at the health department. Um, and now they kind of have to, and sort of kind of like facing the facts that like post capitalism is coming up,
Mhm.
and in order to survive and not become like a homeless person, you need to conform,
Mhm.
and you need to kind of like bite down and kind of like deal with the fact that we don't live like in a world that has been changed, even though there was so much tumult in the 60s, right? So that movie, I think the 70s movie gets very complicated. And then of course the third movie, it definitely takes it takes like I think like a pretty appropriate measure of having it be on a military base, right? Like
Yeah.
conformity, It's ironic, right? Because it's like the 50s movie, you have this movie where it's like all about like like in America, it's beautiful and it's amazing, and it's convincing, right? It's a very convincing movie. It's a great
Mhm.
movie. But it's funny because in the 90s movie, it's like, one of the most powerful institutions in the United States, the one that is bankrolled the most is the United States military, which its foundation is conformity. It
Mhm.
functions because of its conformity.
Yeah, rewatching, and this is true for all three of them. Although I would say the third one is probably the most patient of the three, but definitely for the first two for sure. And I had watched this movie really not that long ago. I mean, maybe it's been a year since I've seen the 1950s Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I've forgotten how much of this film is them running away because they discover
Yeah,
the Body Snatchers. And the first film's only about 80 minutes, which I think is the shortest, although the third one isn't that long
it
either.
is.
The second one's
No, it's like less
definitely,
than 90.
yeah. And then the second
Yeah,
one's, I think, almost 2 hours, I think,
it's almost
right?
2 hours. Yeah,
Yeah.
which
So
I liked.
it
I
works.
like being I like being in that 70s like San
Yeah.
Francisco environment. I couldn't I had no
No,
complaints here.
no complaints where
But the
that's
first movie, the 50s movie, it has a really kind of like fast pace.
incredibly fast paced. Because when I think back of that movie, I think about how much of the movie in my mind is them discovering the body snatchers. And then rewatching
Yeah.
it, I'm like 30 minutes into this movie, I'm like, wait a minute, they already know who the body snatchers are. They
Hmm.
know that they're corrupt, and by the second half of the film is just them running away, which is incredible. Like it's incredible that you can keep
Hmm.
that pacing up for basically 45 minutes. For half of this film
Yeah.
is them, like the town already knows that they're out there, and they have like all these cool tactics, like that moment
I get
where
so tired. I got so tired just watching them run away.
it's a tiring experience. They're
I
fucking
got so
running up
tired.
mountains, going downstairs, going all over the place.
Yeah. They do quite a bit of running in the second movie too, but yeah, the first movie is just kind of like, goddamn. Like I just feel
It's the
it
most.
is so it looks so tiring to me.
Yeah, and of course, I think this third movie goes. It takes more time, but when it gets to that point, as you're kind of saying, it's definitely the most explosive. It's the most violent of the three, for sure. I
It's
mean,
like a George Romero movie. It feels very George Romero-esque.
yeah,
Kind of like what
yeah.
we talked about with what
Hmm.
was the last movie we watched? Nocturama.
Nocturama, Nocturama,
Yeah,
and
kind of like that where it's like kind of like I think I saw you compare it to Day of the Dead, which
Day
is
of the
I think an
Dead.
apt comparison.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like go into any bunkers or anything like that in this movie for the
No.
most part. They don't really stay anywhere for too long, because that's the threat of the body snatchers, right? Like the thing about the zombies is that, if you get into a bunker, you can maybe surround and you have enough guns, you can maybe try to shoot, but it's like in this in body snatchers, it's like they say in the third movie, very well, where are you gonna go? We're everywhere, and yeah, that's the threat. Like if everybody's everywhere, then if the body snatcher people are everywhere, then they have these pods everywhere. So no matter where you go, no matter where you lay your head, like you're gonna turn into a body snatcher. So it's like it's a really bad
It's
it's a threat where
futile.
you can't like go anywhere. You can't like hide in a bunker anywhere or sleep.
Yeah.
It's like, where are you gonna go? Where are you gonna hide? I love, by the way, Meg Tilly, and she's really good in that monologue. By the way, just a kind of a diversion
Yeah.
when uh, she's great. I I think the only other movie I've seen her in is that she's okay in the movie, but because of how kind of like weird and off kilter her performance is, I remember it very well. She
Hmm.
plays like a very memorable character, one of the lead characters in the Psycho sequel,
Oh,
which I recommend.
yeah.
Her acting is like a little off in that movie, but I don't mind it too much. I like her. So she's good. She's good. I think she's kind of off in that movie, but it's entertaining. But she's really good in the Body Snatchers movie.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. Okay, so I'm kind of mixed on this. So like on the one end, one of the things I like about the original one movie that the other two movies don't really get into or steer away from more is in the original movie, which I'd like to, if they made another Body Snatchers, I'd like to explore this area more. Is it's almost impossible to believe them that the Body Snatchers exist because there's right because the doctor goes in and he like talks to these people, and in the
They're
first
happy and
one
smiley. Yeah,
they're happy, they're smiling, like they're able to basically
yeah.
recreate everything that they
They're
do.
pretty convincing. They're convincing replicas of the people.
And that's
Yeah.
what's haunting about the first one is like there's
Hmm.
really no way other than like the look in his eye, right? And the only people that know are the people very close to them, like the son thinking that his mother isn't his mother, or the niece that doesn't think her uncle is her uncle. And yet when everyone
Hmm.
else talks to him, no matter
Yeah.
if they've been snatched or not, you can't tell. And so you have this thing at the beginning of this film where you're like, what's going on? Is this a mass hysteria? Like, do they
Yeah.
really believe this thing? Is this thing actually going on? Where in
Yeah.
the second and especially the third one, it's much more clear who's a body snatcher
Hmm.
because they have this sort of stone cold, uh, inescapable
Hmm.
quality to them. And one of the
Yeah.
reasons I like watching these three in chronological order, if you're going to watch these three, is because in the first one, right, we're in small town America, and the idea is it started here. It's started in a small town and it's going to move to bigger towns, just like the domino effect of supposed cap of communism, where it smarts these small countries and supposedly moves to these bigger countries. And then in the second one, it's a bigger city, and
Yeah.
so the goal in the second one really isn't to escape the city, or rather, the way that the only quote unquote survivor is to live among them, to pretend to be them, of course, with a
Yep.
very haunting and wonderful end to that second movie, that moment where we see Donald Sutherland. And I myself was tricked into it. I thought he was just playing
Iconic
into
ending.
it. I was
I do
fooled.
say I will say it's maybe the best ending out of all three
Of the three,
movies.
agreed.
The first
100%.
movie, obviously, I'm pretty sure, and I read in the first movie that the bookends, I believe, were added in kind of as an afterthought, right?
Hmm.
Kind of like how, like in the Psycho movie, they tack on that ending with like the psychiatrist where he
Yeah.
basically explains it, right? So I think in the original movie it was like, I think the ending was just supposed to be him like running around in the cars and screaming,
Yelling.
which is another unbelievable moment,
Hmm.
one of the best moments out of the three movies. But I think it was so pessimistic that they're just like, all right, we got to put a thing at the end, a thing at the beginning, and then at the end to show that like it turned out to be okay. They got him, which isn't a very realistic ending. I think it
No.
would end up more like in the second and third movie where they just spread, to where the body snatcher things like, and so I think I agree with what you're saying where the body snatchers are more convincing in the first movie. I
Mhm.
agree with you. They're more happy and smiley. In the third movie, they're very aggressive
Yeah.
and mean. They're very, very mean. And the second movie, I think it plays around with this a little bit. Like I'm thinking about like Leonard Nimoy's
Leonard
character,
Nimoy.
his the
Yep.
because like when they're at the book store, at his book launch or whatever, um, you don't it's kind of hard to tell. You don't know if he's a body snatcher or not,
And
right?
great
Like because
casting, by the way.
he's really good.
Yeah.
Again, great. I love the '70s cast in the '70s movie. They're great. And Len because Leonard Nimoy when he's talking about like his pseudo psychology
Pop
bullshit, like in the
psychology. Yeah.
bookstore, yeah, pop psychology shit. He doesn't sound that much different than when you know for sure that he's a body snatcher, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, that's purposeful, right? Like, he might have been a body snatcher at the time. He might have been not. Like people are like going to them and like, oh my husband, my wife, or whatever. They're not the same. They're just
Hmm.
not. And he's like, oh, you're just obviously like internalizing some other problem that you have in your relationship and you're not expressing, it's like you need to like, hold it in, so you need to rein in your emotions and just accept that like he's your husband and stuff, even though they're right. It isn't her husband. So I love that detail of having like Leonard Nimoy like kind of like, is he a body snatcher? Was he a body snatcher then? We know he is now, but he's
Yeah.
talking exactly the same as he was earlier.
Yeah. I mean, with him, it's hard to tell because you can go both ways with him. I mean, you can argue that maybe he was one of the early uh, body snatched. And so then he is sort of selling this idea because he wants people to not think that there's body snatchers. So he's trying to convince them. But on the other hand,
Right.
if you're just a psychologist and these people come to you,
Yeah.
like of course that's the first thing that comes to your mind. You'd be like, oh yeah, this is just sort of weird uh mass hysteria thing going on. And I've noticed not just in these movies, but just in cinema in general, they they really hate psychologists are always sort of have this
Bad rap.
yeah this sort of
Yeah.
dastardly evilness under all of them. Like if you go see a psychologist at some level you're some sort of evil person, which of course is not the case. And I think even with modern films I think we still do that where we paint this picture of that. Like if you go see it, which I definitely get more the most in the 50s because I mean we still had lobotomies and right we still had
Mhm.
asylums and places where the quote
Yeah,
unquote sick but
I just think like because it's the '70s, I feel like, and it takes place in San Francisco, there's sort of like now this kind of like, I feel like the '70s, the end of the '60s into the '70s is like kind of like the beginning of kind of like this self-help,
hmm
kind of like
yeah,
business, right? Which has nothing to do with kind of like, it doesn't really have much to do with like psychology or
he's not
helping
like a
people
real
or anything like that.
psychologist, no.
Yeah, it's more just about like kind of like selling books and like selling like something to someone. It's
Hmm.
ultimately what it's all about, and that's kind of what the movie's all about, I guess you
Oh
could
yeah,
say. Yeah,
which of course is a very modern idea and we see
right.
that still a lot where a lot of the people they're selling this idea of self-help, which is a weird thing to sell. Like the idea that you need to sell your own happiness or you need to buy this book or do this thing and then suddenly you'll be happy instead of going to see a doctor or a professional, which is a lot of what the second movie is about. It's, I mean, as you're pointing out, we're
Yeah.
about to hit the 80s, of course, which is sort of peak American capitalism where everyone's
Yeah,
just
consumerism.
consumerism thriving in this world.
Yeah.
You got the big box store malls and like all that kind of stuff. So here is sort of the death of the 60s era of independence and freedom and this incredibly tumultuous era. And now we're going into the late 70s, early 80s, where we're going to move into conformity and perhaps one of the most conformed times in American history. Everyone
Yeah,
wants to
yeah.
be the same thing and do the same thing. And so that's what the body snatchers sort of
Hmm.
represent is the idea that there's almost this willingness, right? It's almost as if they want to become the body snatchers that you don't see so much. Well, you kind of see in the first film too. And
Yeah.
so they have this repeat of that moment in the first and second film. In the first film, after they're captured, right?
Hmm.
The love interests, they walk out of the uh, whatever building length. I think they're in his doctor's
Hmm.
office. And she sees a dog almost run over. And she
Yeah, yeah.
dies. And then of course the way
Yeah.
the way they fucking recreate it in the second one,
Right. Yeah. It's so good.
that looks so fucking creepy.
It's scary. It's a dog with a man's face.
It's a dog with a man's face.
Right. Because like she stomps on that pod that was by like the homeless man with the banjo, I think, or
Hmm.
guitar. And they and I guess like there was just like an issue, right, with like the pods where the dog now has a human face or whatever. It's great. I love the effects in the 70s movie are great. And in fact, and I like the effects in the 90s movie as well. Those it's it gets pretty goopy
Hmm.
in that movie. 70s gets pretty goopy too. Um yeah. I yeah, I just really like the 70s effects. I think they're very well, like even like early on, like when like they're on the plants and you see kind of like the goopy like thing that's like moving on it, like that looks so good.
The 70s effects definitely are. I think in some ways the most convincing because they're just so kind of
Yeah.
gross and weird. Although the 70s one is the sort of spidery like look to them when they're
Yeah, it's
growing. And
amazing.
the 90s kind of has the more goopy. And I do love though the because there's this is also true with the 90s one. And I think more so than the other two. Although this the 70s one definitely plays with this idea too, but I think the 90s one plays much more with the idea of sort of there's this sexualness to it,
There's like
right?
there's like a violation aspect to it. There's
Mm-hmm.
more that to me feels like very very Ferrera-esque, by the way, like kind of like the sexual violation of it, which
Mm-hmm.
he has quite a few movies that have this theme in it, kind of like a violation, assault, rape, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and of course, right, these people are unconscious and these
Yeah.
vines, right, they're the way they kind of creep and crawl over you
Ugh.
and
They go in your mouth and
go
stuff.
into your
Ugh.
mouth and your nose and all your
Yeah,
orifices.
it's
And
disgusting.
this one of the three is the only one where the way to get them out of it is like you have to rip off the vines, which I think is one of the problems I have with the first one. And I think both the second one and the third one do a better job with this, especially the third one. I think the third one does this part the best, which is like in the first
Yeah.
one, it's kind of unclear like how they
They
go
they
from like
have
their
they have no
consciousness.
effects.
Yeah,
They have no effects really to kind of like work with.
which I get.
You know,
I mean, they have some
when
cool
they go in the
moments.
greenhouse and they see kind of like the pods, that
Looks
is
cool.
cool. They look fucked up. It's like, oh, cool. I'm sure in color they would look worse.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, but they don't really have like a lot to work with.
No.
So I see what you mean though. So part of me kind of wonders if just like there's like that aspect of just it like maybe there is like kind of like a transference like through the air, not necessarily through anything touching it.
Right.
So but I don't know.
But I guess the
uh
pod has to already exist because like well,
yeah,
I was thinking about this because of course his love interest, she falls asleep and then
yeah,
she turns into the by snatcher.
yeah,
And we remember that moment, which of course they recreate in the 70s version,
hmm,
where he goes to smash all of them, but the only one he can actually smash is his own.
right,
So I guess he could sleep because his like the idea is like the body snatcher version has to already like the body has to
yeah,
exist for it to go to sleep. And I think that's why he would have been okay. But she's not because he didn't destroy her body because when he went to go destroy the
hmm,
bodies, he couldn't destroy hers.
right. And I think like too, like I think like the idea too is that the pods are everywhere, right? Like they're kind of like
Hmm.
they're hidden in places. So no, again, no matter, you're not safe. Where are you gonna go? If you fall asleep, then like there will be a pod waiting for you to violate you or take your soul or whatever, and then copy you into the body into the alien you know robot clone.
Yeah, it reminds me when I was in middle school. It was the first, and this is the reason why I had such a disdain for horror films for so long. Is in middle school I saw this horror film that I definitely shouldn't have been let into. It was an R-rated film, and I was
Damn.
maybe like 10 or 11 years old. And I was going with some of my
Oh
friends who were
no.
older. So they were like 14, 15. And of course, the guy at the counter was like a teenager, right? They didn't give a shit. They're like, whatever.
Yeah, they didn't check an ID or whatever.
No. And to this day, I have no idea what the film was, and I don't know really how to find out.
Hmm.
I'm sure if
What
I
year
put
was it?
enough effort. Man, it was middle school, so what? Maybe like
Do you remember how
2009,
old you were?
2010? It was definitely before high school. I
Hmm.
know that for sure.
It scared you?
It was this terrifying film about whenever you fell asleep, like this thing would
Mhm.
come and get you. I don't know. It was
It
like a
follows?
no, it wasn't It
No.
Follows. I love It Follows. No, it wasn't like a good film. Or
Okay.
I don't think it was. I think it was just like
It was trashy.
one of those like trashy like horror films of that era.
Hmm.
And the only thing I can remember from this film is there's this moment in this film, there's this guy, it had something to do with the internet. Like
Hmm.
somehow the internet attacked you, or I don't know. I guess it had like this ring sort of aspect to it, like the TV, but it was like with the internet. And I remember the scene where it's the only scene I remember from this movie, but for weeks I couldn't sleep like at all, fucking all. And still sometimes it haunts me. All I remember is there's a scene where like you're in this small claustrophobic room and everything is red and
Uh,
he's like has duct tape everywhere. Like everything's duct tape because that's the only way to keep the thing. But no matter what happens, like when you fall asleep, this like thing, but it's not like a creature. It's not like a
hmm.
creature movie. It's more of like I don't know, more
Hmm.
like ghostly, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
again, I
If I
remember
was
very
in honestly, if I was in the body snatcher world, I would just fold because like the thought of like having to like keep myself awake for like more than like 24 hours, like even more than like you like that to me is just like I'm done. Like I'm gonna lose. Like I'm gonna fall asleep. Like it's
just
not
gonna
gonna
go to
happen.
bed.
Like yeah, I would just like I would not be able to do it. I don't think.
I do love the idea that they only do this in the second one, but the idea that you can survive in this world if you just pretend to be like they can be fooled. And so
Yeah,
you have her who, I mean, supposedly for perhaps months, years even, she has survived amongst
right.
these creatures, and
Yeah, she fools them.
which is somehow more
Hmm.
terrifying than running away. Because at least running away, you
She's
have an
really
option.
good.
She's
Veronica Cartwright. She's a great
amazing.
actor.
Veronica's
Yeah. And
amazing.
her in the like the 70s movie again. I think I like the 70s movie just because I think like it really kind of like is honestly like if I had to pick one of the three, I think all three movies are equally great.
Mhm.
Like they're honest. I would say like each one like even like I think each one is equally great in their own way. But honestly, I think I prefer the 70s film just because like I think it's like a little bit more complicated because you have like you have like the Brooke Adams, she is married to her husband and he becomes like a body snatcher, and then Donald Sutherland and Brooke Adams like kind of have like their own dynamic that they're working with, and then like Jeff Goldblum and Veronica Cartwright are also a couple and they have their own dynamic as well, and they're great actors, and you have like the Leonard Nimoy character. I just think it has like more characters that are doing like more things. So I think like it's more like entertaining and complex, and you have like their different like configurations and things like that kind of play off the body snatchers thing. So I don't know, I really like that aspect about it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I love all three, and I always have a certain affinity to the 1950s version because it plays off of one of my favorite genres, the original noir. But I will admit that there is something about that 70s version that has a certain complexity to it. And this exploration that I don't think either of the other two, whether we're talking about the 90s version or the 50s version, I
Yeah.
think the 90s and 50s are maybe a little more boilerplate in the sense of here are the things that we're going to do and we're going to go do it. And they're still very exciting and very fun, especially just the violence of the 90s version or the noir aspects of the 50s version and sort of the discovery of it. But w the 70s version definitely, I think
It's more perplexing.
it's more perplexing. And I leave that film feeling more than I think the 50s
Yeah.
version or the 90s version. Of course, with the 90s version, there's a sort of futility that, no matter who they destroy, right? They're giant explosions, they're killing all these people. It's like it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter where you
Right.
go. As, of course, that famous speech that we've
Yeah,
referenced
where
a
are you gonna
couple of
go?
times.
So
There's a
true.
certain futility to it. And with the 50s version, you kind of have that ending that's sort of latched on. But I like to believe in my heart of hearts that even though they said, "Oh, we're going to call the FBI and these kind of people," like it's already too late. Just the fact that they discovered these pods in this other
Hmm.
part of town. Like it's too late. There's nothing you can do. They're doomed
Are
anyways.
you talking about the 50s movie? You're talking about the
The
50s
50s
movie,
one,
right?
yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of hard to, I don't know.
I mean,
Again,
I,
I think
I know
it's
that
more, it's definitely, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I know that they're trying to be like, oh, you gotta give them hope, and people aren't gonna go
Is
see
it?
the movie if you don't give them hope and blah blah and all that stuff. And would the movie be better without that first and last scene? Maybe, but again, I would
Yeah.
love to see it. I would like someone to remake the Body Snatchers because it's about time. I mean, they remake it right about every 20 years, and the last one was made.
There's one called The Invasion that came out in the 2000s that doesn't seem to be as people don't seem to be as enamored with that movie as these other ones.
Okay,
So I
who
don't know.
knows? Maybe it's time to make another one. I think I would
It could
love
be
to see a
about
version.
TikTok.
What?
It could be about TikTok.
It could be.
Oh, that would be really cool. I'm being sarcastic if you haven't noticed. It'd be about TikTok, how these TikTokers, or
Yeah. Oh yeah, the
they're pretty much
influencers.
they're all the same. They're like the body snatchers. I'm like Bill Maher. I sound like Bill
I'm like
Maher.
Bill Maher.
I sound like him. It's like a Bill Maher joke. Shitty
Yeah,
Bill Maher joke.
but that's why I wish they explored more in the 50s version, and they don't really do this in the other versions.
Hmm.
Is this idea that what if like the body snatchers aren't real? Like let's just take a moment, like consider like
Yeah.
what if he really is just going crazy? I would love to play with
Yeah.
that a little bit more, right? Let's get more into that like perspective of maybe he is just a person. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe we do a new version where he has some past trauma, right, that
Another
affects how
movie,
he sees the
a
world.
movie that suddenly occurred to me that's like that is like The Truman Show.
Yeah. Where but again with the Truman Show too, right? We
Yeah,
know great movie, but we know pretty early
that's
on
true. We
that
know. Yeah, we know he's in the
like
show. Yeah.
imagine a Truman Show, but like us, like in the perspective of Truman, like
Yeah.
not actually knowing if he's
Oh,
going crazy or not. Like, are people
yeah.
watching him, or is this just how the world exists? And I'd love to see
Hmm.
that with a version of the Body Snatchers of uh does like are these body snatchers real? And this is a real medical condition, right? It's an actual
Right.
psychological condition that people uh, deal with is this imposter syndrome, this idea that the people that they have loved have been replaced. It's a type of schizophrenia. And so I would
Yeah.
love to explore that. Is this sort of like, in the film with like, did this really happen, or is this a person just suffering with some sort of traumatic psychosis?
Yeah. Have you ever
Uh,
seen the Clint Eastwood movie, The Changeling?
uh,
It's kind of like that, where it's
okay.
like a movie. It's sort of like that, where like a woman like she loses her daughter, her son, and they're
Hmm.
like, "We found your son. Here he is," and she's like, "Great." And then the son comes and it's like, "That's not my son. That's like another child."
Oh
And
shit.
they're like, "You're crazy. We're gonna send you to a mental facility." And they do like that's like the plot of the movie. So that's kind of almost what
Okay.
you're thinking
It,
of,
it's
sort
it's on
of.
there, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that moment in the 90s version where the little boy runs up to the helicopter at the end of the film. Did not expect
that
that. Not gonna
that
lie.
part where they throw him out of the helicopter is one of the best moments out of all three movies. The throwing the little kid out the helicopter is
Like a
was
6-year-old
so
boy.
funny. I could not believe that they did that. Like it's so that's just that is awesome. I love that part of the movie. That part of the yeah, I like the again like we could yeah like the 90s movie is just kind of like that has some pretty shocking moments, right? Like Forrest Whitaker shooting himself, uh like when she like turns into dust too, when the kid witnesses his own mom like turn into dust. It's like a
Yeah.
violent
Fucking
moment.
traumatic.
Like yeah, like throwing the kid out of the helicopter. The screaming in that movie is particularly like pronounced, right? Like when Meg Tilly does it too, right?
Hmm.
After she does her monologue, it's like, whoa, that's a powerful moment. So
Although
yeah,
I
I
think the
like
screaming in the second one, that's my favorite scream of the
Well, no, and I mean the one at the end, like with Donald Sutherland, is of course like a is like iconic ending,
iconic.
which is why they put it in the '90s movie, right? Of course,
Yeah.
they had to put it in there,
You have to.
where they're pointing and screaming at each other.
Hmm.
It's great. So, um, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I'm just like, man, like the '90s movies. So, I don't know. I kind of like go I kind of jump around, but I think ultimately my favorite one is the 70s movie. That was the one that's the one I think I would be most likely to rewatch.
Hmm.
Um I think out of all three, if I had to pick one, just again, because I just think it has like this complexity to it that's kind of like fun to part and parcel. But then but but they're all equally great. Like
Oh, so
I
much fun.
can't like I'm not knocking any of them. They're all great.
No,
I love
yeah.
them all.
Yeah, and I think the least favorite of my three is the 90s one, but then I keep going back to like these things in the 90s one that are so particular to just that one. Like that moment where we see the dad uh, after we had no idea if he's been body snatched or not. There's kind of like this hint of maybe he has, but he gets in the
Yeah,
car with his daughter and son,
yeah. They try to drive
and they're
away.
driving away, and you're like, is
Yeah.
he real? Even like after he's shot, right? You still have a second of like, is it actually him? Has he been snatched? And it's
Right,
not.
and he says like, doesn't he say like, you can't act like too emotional, like he's doing the thing in the other
Yeah,
movies where it's like
he's
pretending.
playing
So you're
off
kind of
that.
like, oh, okay, all right, like, and yeah, you're right. I love that moment where they shoot him and you're like, no, he's not. Oh, and then he is a body
And then he
snatcher.
is. So it's okay. He
So they
is.
were right. Okay, yeah, yeah. It's so good. Yeah, again, they're more kind of like devious and evil in
Yeah.
the third movie. They're really kind of like they're really terrible. uh, yeah,
Oh yeah. And you kind of see this progression through them where with the first one, there's almost like this soothsayer quality to them where they're
right,
trying to convince you that like, oh no, this is for the betterment of humankind. We are here to
right.
create
No
peace,
fear, no love,
which
no
is
anxiety.
it's kind of a haunting argument, like this idea that
Yeah.
the whole reason we have war and terror, and I think there is like a real argument which would be interesting to explore again if you man another invasions of the Bystanders movie is like all of these evil things in the world, things genocides and holocausts and all
Yeah.
the terrible thing, the nuclear war exist because of our supposed differences. And if we existed in the world where we're all the same, where we're all body snatched, we'd still have our conscience, like we still exist, we still survive, but then no one would be hurting each other. There would be no hate in the world.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of convincing argument, especially in the first one. But then of course with like the second and especially the third one, like the third one, it's definitely this ominous presence that like, no, we're
Yeah.
gonna fucking murder all of you. Like we don't give a
Yeah.
shit.
In the name of in the name of our alien race to
Our
continue,
alien
we will
race.
kill you.
Even the opening of the 70s one where you see the little
Hmm.
is that it almost looks like footage like straight from the deep sea kind of anima. Like it looks so good.
Yeah, it's good. It's lovely.
It's beautiful. Just those little things floating through space, conquering galaxies. Oh man. Well, we're about to hit an hour.
Yeah.
So should we wrap up our trilogy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go ahead. I think we've talked enough about it.
You go first. I think I went first last week.
Well, I mean, like I like all three. I would give all three like an 8 out of 10, So, um, again, I think, they're really fun movies. I'm glad we did it because they're very fun movies to watch. I love the idea of it is very cinematic. And all three movies are great because they offer kind of like a different, they obviously like take the premise to heart, but of course, it's just like a good kind of like example to see like how like filmmakers, writers, actors, the time periods can kind of like change how a movie looks and acts and everything. So, but ultimately, all three movies are just really fun to watch. And again, I think I prefer the 70s movie. I think I ultimately have to prefer that one. But yeah, I love all three.
Yeah, I can't help but agree with all of those sentiments. I also give all three an 8 out of 10. And I was a little concerned going into this experience because these are remakes or rather, the second two are remakes of the original. And there's been quite a few remakes of this film. And so I was afraid that these films would be so similar to each other that watching all three in a single
Yeah.
week would not be a satisfying experience. And yet these films, even though they're coming from the same premise and hit a lot of the same beats, they are so different from each other because these are all three filmmakers who have a very specific idea of how they make their movies. And so they feel like individual pieces. And so it's more as if these people are, and of course it is coming from a book. So I think that helps too, is, they're also drawing from that piece too. So it definitely feels like you're seeing these same ideas expressed through these different filmmakers. And so you get to see more of their personality than maybe if you just watched, three random films by three random filmmakers, or even, their most famous film by three famous filmmakers. By watching something that has this sort of cohesion to it is really nice because you can see like here are the things that they're interested in. Here's how it's representing in a mirror of sorts to the time that they're in and the worries that they have at that moment. So I really enjoyed all three experiences. And honestly, I think I'm with you. I don't know if going into it, I was pretty convinced that the 50s version was going to be my favorite because that's around my favorite era, favorite time. But and I
Yeah.
love Don Siegel, Manchurian Candidate, another incredible film. But that 70s version, I mean, they do a lot with that extra 30 minutes. I didn't think that there was a whole lot you could do. I thought 80 minutes, you did it all. There was really nothing to add there, but they really add a lot of complexity. And I think of the three, it is the one that maybe I'd love to watch the 50s one again just for the enjoyment of it. Same with the
Yeah,
90s
yeah.
one. But I think I'd want to watch the 70s one again with the intensity of the original watch because
Hmm.
there is so much there to sort of look at and think about and wonder about and think about, is Leonard Nimoy, is he a body snatch
Yeah.
from the very beginning, or is that just him,
Yeah.
and how do we tell the difference, and how do you cope with these kind of things? So a really just a wonderful trilogy of film. Very glad that we got to do this.
Yeah.
All right, y'all, thank you for listening. You can find everything I do at Austin Lugo.
I'm on Letterboxd at Retro Andrew, RTR0 Andrew.
And you can find this podcast wherever you hear podcasts. You also find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I have nothing to say. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much.